Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Smith, Director of CIPRI.
And welcome to the third day of the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, convened this year, as every year, by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs working together. But as you know, convened this year online for obvious reasons. We have a really interesting, intense afternoon, or depending where you are, morning or evening, of discussion on the theme of building peace in the time of COVID-19. I'll be introducing the topic and the panel in a moment, but to begin with, we kick off with former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, former Foreign Minister of Sweden, the chair of the CIPRI Governing Board, and indeed also my friend, Jan Eliasson.
Thank you very much, Dan. Dear forum participants, as chair of CIPRI Governing Board, I welcome you warmly to this high-level session of the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development. I'm glad and grateful that our co-host, Foreign Minister Ann Linde, is joining us for today's session. As you may know, this is the 7th edition of the forum, but the first ever virtual digital one. We are overwhelmed by the positive response and by seeing how many people we have gathered online at this moment. We have over 2,000 registered participants from more than 60 countries and many, many more following on social media. This shows, in my view, that there is a widespread longing and a need to meet, discuss, and analyze our current situation. There seems to be an urge among many to create normality out of today's abnormal circumstances. And I think this meeting is an example of that. When we at CIPRI understood the extent of COVID-19, we first thought that we would have to cancel this event. But we quickly decided, together with the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, that we would instead do everything to move this to a forum online. This was technically rather challenging, but we thought that we had to do it, and I think it has worked as of yet, and it's so important in view of today's serious global situation that we have this type of dialogue. I would now like to thank our great partner organizations from all over the world for your commitments and your efforts to make this forum happen. It would not have been possible without you, and of course not without the young communication expertise representing our new digital and interconnected world. Beyond the wonders of technology, this shows us that a crisis doesn't have to divide us. It can bring us together to discuss and solve problems. As we all know, the world is facing an explosive crisis, a pandemic with far-reaching economic, social, and political consequences for our societies and our peoples. The COVID-19 crisis has increased vulnerability of the least protected and the most exposed in our societies. And in many countries, not least in the South, the effects on the economy and food supply may be more deadly than the virus itself. At the same time, we must not forget that the problems we were grappling with before the crisis, they are still there. Some of them have even become more challenging. In the midst of this pandemic, and at a time when we see nations turning inwards to fight the virus, to protect their citizens, understandably, it is critical that we continue our work to address the serious challenges waiting for us also after COVID-19. Climate change and inequalities, not least gender inequality, are only two examples. Global challenges can never be overcome in isolation, but must be tackled through dialogue and cooperation. This meeting will offer us an opportunity to not only discuss the problems of today, but also the world we will face and the world we hope to shape after the pandemic. The focus of the 2020 Stockholm Forum is on sustaining peace in the time of COVID-19. This requires that we look to both the short-term and the long-term perspectives in our response. Here I'm confident that our excellent speakers and forum partners will advise, inspire, and challenge us all. In closing, let me quote Dag Hammarskjöld, the former Swedish UN Secretary General. He was also a devoted mountaineer, and he once said as words of encouragement in a crisis situations, I quote, "Never measure the height of a mountain until you have reached the top. Then you will see how low it was." I think this will give us hope and encouragement in our work. Today's challenges are certainly huge and extraordinary, but today is not the time to be immobilized by seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Today is the time to work together and to find common solutions to common problems, and not least, to realize that good international solutions are in our national interests. So with these words, I'm honored to introduce and welcome the United Nations Secretary General António Guterres to the Stockholm Forum. He has, during this crisis, day and night, together with his colleagues, sent powerful messages about the necessity of international cooperation and necessity of international solidarity. We are grateful for the following message from the Secretary General. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to greet the Stockholm Forum. You gather as the COVID-19 pandemic has plunged the world into an unprecedented crisis with devastating consequences for people, economies, and progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The world's most vulnerable populations are most in jeopardy. And women are experiencing a double damaging impact. They make up the majority of the most affected sectors and face an increased risk of violence as they are often trapped at home with their abusers. The COVID-19 pandemic also poses a threat to international peace and security, hindering our ability to engage in diplomacy and potentially leading to an increase in social unrest and violence. This demands a global, coordinated, and decisive response. I have appealed for a global ceasefire. We have launched plans to help countries deal with the socio-economic fallout and to ensure flows of humanitarian assistance. We must also build back better by reducing inequality, strengthening resilience, and building just, inclusive, and sustainable economies and societies. I count on this year's Stockholm Forum discussion to contribute to the unity, leadership, and solidarity we need at this defining moment.
So we are so grateful for that comment and those words from the UN Secretary General António Guterres. Encouraging, helpful, insightful, inspiring as always. And I just want to put in a quick apology to my boss, Jan Eliasson, for giving him the wrong title in his former position. He was, of course, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, not Under Secretary General. Now, we're going to move on now with our panel. And let me start off by introducing them to you. First of all, the Foreign Minister of Sweden, Ann Linde. You're very, very welcome here, and thank you so much for finding the time to be able to do this with us and for us. And I just want to underline again our gratitude for the good cooperation we have with the Foreign Ministry in putting this on. Also joining us, Thomas Greminger, the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. From New York joining us, Rosemary DiCarlo, the Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs and Peace Building in the United Nations. Actually, also from New York, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations for Peacekeeping and a member of the CIPRI Governing Board, Jean-Marie Guénaud. And all of you very welcome here. And in addition, we will be joined by Ilwad Elman, from whom, first of all, we're going to hear. Now, Ilwad is from Somalia. She was brought up for much of the time in Canada. Her father was an activist for peace who lost his life in the service of that cause in the 1990s. She returned to Somalia in 2010 at a time when the fighting was still going on and lots of Parts of Somalia, central and south especially, were controlled by al-Shabaab. And together with her mother, she set up a rape crisis center for survivors of gender-based violence, and also working for increasing the space for women in the peace-building and security sectors. Let's now hear from Ilwad.
Thank you for the introduction, and welcome, everyone, to the Stockholm Virtual Forum on Peace and Development. I'm joining you from Mogadishu, Somalia. And for the first time, when friends and colleagues call me from all over the world to ask, how's it going? I can answer, probably the same as on your end. I answer from a similar confine of a lockdown, and with the same heavy heart and frustration as the voice on the other end of the line. Not long ago, and to much extent, we still do, live in such a polarized and divided world where identity politics and the demonization of entire communities was and is still our norm, where the situation in country X was their reality and unfathomable to country Y, and a disconnect in humanity so severe that we are starting to lose sight of the fact that we are all human and we have the same needs, and we are letting this negatively influence our shared peace, our prospect for development, and most our pursuit and access to basic rights. If there's something that I think we can all agree on, or at least acknowledge of the COVID-19, it's that we have all been thrown into a crash course in empathy, a shared understanding of our fragility, and that man-made borders do not change how tragedy affects us as people, that we all hurt when we lose our loved ones. We all flee when forced to seek safety, and where possible, we try to help each other. A lot of people learned for the first time what it means to be a refugee, I guess. Look, 24-hour global press coverage of the coronavirus means there's little that I can say that hasn't already been said about the pandemic that was not only foreseeable, but widely foreseen. What hasn't been said enough, in layman terms, however, outside of the traditional policy spaces, is the crisis of multilateralism that COVID-19 has coincided with. How it's weakened the system of multilateralism and has even amplified the global trust deficit. In many cases, countries have resolved turning inwards. Unilateralism, blame games, and responsibility shifting, which I'm sure our policy community assembled here today have seen firsthand. Radio silence and crickets from the UN Security Council and a fractured G7 and G20. National security strategies have in many places been blindsided and revealed the imbalanced investments that we've been making for years. Investments that do not match the actual versus perceived threat pictures. On 23rd of March, the UN Secretary General launched his appeal for a global ceasefire and highlighted the impact and double vulnerabilities of women, children, people with disabilities, and the displaced. He warned of the compounded effects of COVID-19 to the already challenged lives of special interest groups. I welcomed the call for a ceasefire, and I was moved greatly by the SG's leadership. The early momentum from the countries that answered the call also demonstrated the widespread support for this move. The call to silence the guns by raising the voices for peace presented real hope. 2.2 million signatures were collected in record speed. But that momentum slowed almost as fast as it came, and we missed the opportunity to act together. When Security Council members began and continued to disagree about the effect of a possible COVID ceasefire resolution on their own military operations, we are not acting as one UN. We know that conflict disproportionately impacts the health and safety and the human rights of women and girls. And we know that the best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how well its women are treated. And that is why remembering the gendered impacts of COVID-19 remains so important, even in the pandemic that on the surface is said to not discriminate. Women make up 70% of the global healthcare workforce, and from past health emergencies, the critical role that local women leaders have taken in breaking community transmission cycles has been literally life-saving. Now, outside of the healthcare sector, we are witnessing a global maturity in the perceptions of women's leadership. So many women acted first and made the bold and unpopular call to shut down life as we knew it in the face of a truly invisible enemy. While some male leaders showed great leadership too, the amount of women leaders doing well amidst this crisis is remarkable. And it reinforces the ambitions of our wider gender equality and women, peace, and security agenda. COVID-19 coincides with the 25-year anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and 20 years since the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. The shortcomings of these global commitments and the comprehensive and meaningful progress that we need becomes painfully visible during times such as these. To fulfill the promise of 1325 and the Beijing Declaration, we must start with ensuring gender-responsive and conflict-sensitive approaches now. I'm trying to highlight our small wins where I can, in the forms of silver linings here and there, but let's be real. There isn't much to celebrate. A lot of lives have been lost, and more people are fighting for theirs right now. And the reason why we are here convening online as a global community of policymakers, practitioners, and just concerned people is because we know how dire the situation truly is. So I'm not going to use this platform to mince words and pat ourselves on the back for being unprepared for the cluster mess that we foresaw and are now in. 1.54 billion children are out of classrooms. Many of them, particularly girls, are unlikely to return. The economic uncertainty and hopelessness that young people feel for their future, and the very real risk 42 million to 66 million children face falling into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19 terrifies me. As a child of Somalia and by extension, a child of war, in my 30 years of life, my country has been and still is in war. I know what we are risking by not acting faster, multilaterally. We are risking another lost generation, mental health impacts, and a devastating consequence for deepened inequality. If we fail here, this is something that we don't recover from. And that is why it's so important we do business differently now and open doors for young leaders. I'm proud of the young women and men who are exemplifying and innovating in their responses to COVID. For example, Lina Lopez for Brazil. She launched a digital emergency information and counseling network to ensure that women and girls still have access to sexual and reproductive health services. Mohammed Adawar, a 21-year-old engineer from Mogadishu, built a respirator that is now being used in hospital. Nate Mook, a young CEO of the World Kitchen Center with celebrity chef Jose Andre. They're providing meals in the wake of natural disasters and have now focused on ensuring access to food during COVID. This group serves as an example to others in the private sector of how businesses must also respond during trying times as these. The Elman Peace Center, which I serve in Somalia, has transformed our vocational training institutes into frontline production spaces of face masks. We're also manufacturing protective and sanitation gear for healthcare workers. And students that have learned skills such as plumbing in our institutes are now fixing portable hand washing stations into the camps and vulnerable communities. These examples are just a drop in the ocean in comparison to the many other global innovations and responses we have seen. We know there are many good people doing good things right now. We see governments celebrating domestic and allocating funds for development and innovation. But we also see governments that have used the pandemic to advance restrictions and attacks on human rights. Military responses to enforce the lockdown have disproportionately targeted marginalized communities, a double standard of enforcement. Pictures of police violence in the vicinity of New York's East Village public housing complex, contrasted with the friendly police handing out face masks in Chelsea's parks. Multiple cases of innocent bystanders being shot dead by police across the globe in attempts to enforce lockdowns. Corona responses often equal the criminalization of poverty. Journalists reporting on COVID-19 are receiving death threats and harassments including by security actors. Protecting health and human rights should never be mutually exclusive. Allow me to just paint a picture for you of where I am right now in Somalia, a context that could be best described as a disaster within a disaster. COVID-19 is just one among many life-threatening crises. And people will tell you, come bombs, guns, famine, and drought, we will still live hand to mouth and have to go out into the street for sustenance, for survival. We will still gather by the thousands to seek protection and guidance from Allah at the mosques, as we have done in the face of danger every day. And coronavirus, it's just another. It's truly a sad and morbid reality seeing people give up before the fight has even begun. Can you imagine being challenged to decide which death is going to be worse? There is a significant increase in conflicts, in hunger and poverty, with the spectrum of famine in many fragile regions now looming. This re-emphasizes the importance of the development and security nexus. Somalia tops the global pandemic risk index. And the interconnections and interdependence of these different threats shows us that we still need to rethink how investments in countries affected by conflict are sequenced. And we must move beyond the sequenced dichotomies of affected by conflict and post-conflict processes. A country like Somalia needs sustainable, long-term investments in healthcare and climate-resilient economies if our peace-building efforts are meant to last. Only then can countries like mine and the many in similar situations be in a better position to respond to a crisis like COVID-19. The intersections of health, climate, and peace in this crisis reinforces the need to continue to invest in operationalizing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the world is looking to this community gathered here today for some concrete pathways to action. One quote that we've repeatedly heard and seen from different leaders and influencers of sort is that the virus doesn't discriminate. This is only half the truth. The virus may not discriminate, but our world sure does. Across the globe, including in wealthy nations, and those that were initially lauded with a good COVID response, we have seen that death rates have been vastly higher among communities of color and migrant communities. Stockholm is even an example of that. The world knows and sees, and history will remember the leaders out there who, true to Machiavellian Churchill's mantra of never let a good crisis go to waste, that are trying to push partisan and divisive agendas at a time like this. But what peace building in Somalia has taught me and asks of me is to be perpetually hopeful. It's also taught me to be realistic and tangible in my efforts. And because we are not gathered here to agonize, but rather organize, I will conclude by sharing some actionable and realistic ideas. The COVID-19 pandemic is both a public health emergency and a human crisis. And it poses a considerable risk to hard-won peace-building gains around the world. The UN Peacebuilding Fund has the infrastructure and demonstrated impact to be operationalized during this crisis. Supporting this fund means leaving no one behind and ensuring that countries in conflict can also survive and rebuild from this. We must remember we have more answers than we think, and that it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel. We have been preparing and waiting to be activated in the event of a pandemic like this. The women and youth, peace and security legacies, combined with the digital innovations we are blessed with today, has given us a bigger and greater community of actors available to deliver the practical and realistic actions we need now. So I urge to move the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 and the recommendations from the Missing Peace Report from policy to delivery. Although I'm grateful for the CIPRI team who have managed to convene us online from all corners of the world to have this important conversation, we have a real opportunity to do business differently. And I don't mean just switching to Zoom calls. I conclude with my deepest condolences to everyone who's had to bury a loved one, or actually couldn't even bury their loved one in a dignified manner because of this. And I express my profound gratitude and admiration for frontline and essential workers everywhere. You serve as a shining example and reminder to the policy community of what it means to put the collective interest ahead of the individual. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ilwad Elman. That is a wide-ranging, inspiring speech. Let's move straight on. Foreign Minister Ann Linde, take up some part of that central theme that Ilwad was pursuing there. The effects of the pandemic of COVID-19 on security, on peace and conflict issues, including perhaps in conflict-affected countries, both the risks and if you see any of the opportunities. What do you see there?
Well, thank you very much, Dan. But first, let me say thank you to Ilwan for a wonderful speech and very many thoughts after her speech. And also, I would like to say thank you to all you at CIPRI and my predecessor, Jan Eliasson. I actually think this is a very good way to put a spotlight on what the pandemic the consequences, because it will have massive and far-reaching consequences on peace and security, on climate, on inequalities, on a lot of issues. And I think that the risks for international peace and security are real, because the COVID-19 can reinforce already existing conflict dynamics, but it can also create new dynamics. We can see also geopolitical tension. It's just to listen to what we have heard from China and United States the last days. It's really not give you some comfort. On the other hand, it's creating tensions also on the world stage. I also am very worried that authoritarian actors are using and taking advantage of the current situation when all governments and many organizations are trying to fight the pandemic. They push their undemocratic agenda, undermining the work of journalists and also democratic structures in the name of the pandemic. And that's something that is frightening to me. But of course, as you say, is there some opening? There can be some openings. There can be, for example, an insight to some people that multilateralism is needed, that we will not be able to fight this pandemic ourselves. From the beginning, it was a very strong nationalist and isolationist reaction. But I think just after a few weeks, you could see that multilateralism was gaining strength again. And I would say, for example, the United Nations Secretary General, which we heard here in his appeal, his call for global ceasefire was really important. And we could see in some countries, Sudan, Colombia, the Philippines, that there has been tension, but others has taken advantage also of the call for ceasefire. But the multilateralism is used.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that one of the important things here, I agree with you about the emphasis on the multilateralism and the cooperation. It seems to me that maybe one of the things that the pandemic, I mean, see what you think about this. I'm not a politician, you're a politician. Politicians need to think about what ordinary citizens are thinking about. Seems to me that maybe the pandemic is going to be saying, look, cooperation is the only realistic way. And it's the only realistic way on the pandemic, clear, but also climate change, also cyber vulnerability, also a whole set of other issues. Do you see that possibility unfolding?
I see that possibility, but I also see the risk. I mean, the possibilities is, of course, that we need the World Health Organization to work together for a vaccine. We need a cooperation to fight it. At the same time, there could be people who are using it also for xenophobic reason, to say this country is good, this country is bad, there will be tensions on the borders, and we know what that could lead to. And we as political leaders really have to try to make measures that is non-discriminatory and that is proportionate according to the threat.
Sure. And so maybe the last question, because I know you're very stuck for time, not surprisingly in these difficult times. Do you think there is a chance that we will actually see the UN Security Council begin to, as many people want, as Ilwad was calling for, see it step up and take some leadership on this issue? Well,
actually, I would say I'm very impressed by the way the Secretary General handled it. I am impressed that the General Assembly of the United Nations has managed to go together a resolution. I'm not that impressed with the Security Council.
And that's because the geopolitical toxin is in there.
The geopolitical toxin, and I think it's a shame really that there is no common answer to this. And I think that the Security Council need actually to use their political influence in this crisis, because it's also a crisis for peace and security in the long run. So I hope for more, and I expect more from the United Nations Security Council. And one more issue I would like to just raise is, especially when I heard Ilwad to speak, is the role of women in all this. I and several other female foreign ministers, we just put forward a proposed resolution to the United Nations on how women is affected in this crisis. And also we have written an article together with United Nations Women Organization, UN Women Organization, because we can see that some of the measures you need to have your gender lenses on. Because even if more men die, as far as we know, from the virus, the measures in the fight against the virus is actually not very positive for women. You can see domestic violence is on the rise. You can see 70% in the healthcare sector are women, and they have precarious work. They go in without any protection. And you can also see that you push the important issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights in the background, to say that this is not important now because of the pandemic. So I would like to raise the issue of women and gender also in this time.
And I think, again, what we see is, yes, there's a double burden that women are carrying, but we're also seeing a lot of women stepping forward and being very prominent in these issues.
Then before I go, I have to say that last week I met via ICANN 30 women on video from 12 different time zones, from different countries as Yemen, Colombia, Sudan, Syria, and we discussed peace, women, peace and security, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I think that even in these terrible times when you cannot meet, you learn to use the digitalization also in a positive way. Yeah. I don't say I like it very much, but this was very, very good.
There are upsides as well as downsides. Yeah. Anne-Linda, thank you so much for finding time for us in what I know is a very busy day and a very busy calendar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So we go on now with the panel, but before I start putting questions to the panel, I have a question, well, two questions actually, in fact, two complicated questions that I want to ask you, watching and participating. I also want to remind you that as well as this online poll, which I'm about to introduce, there's the possibility to be asking questions through the platform that we're using for this. You can see it in the equivalent of the chat function. So here are the two questions. in order for us to come back well from the pandemic, who, in your view, are the key actors? Is it A, government, B, international organizations, C, the private sector, D, communities and civil society organizations, or obviously E, a combination of all of the above? And then the second question repeats that for building peace. Who are the key actors? Is it government or international organizations, the private sector, communities and civil society organizations, or a combination of some or all of the above? And if you answer question 1, question 2 pops up on your screens, and we'll get the results in a bit and we'll discuss them when they arrive. Now over to the panel. So I want to begin, if I may, with Thomas Greminger, the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And we've heard from Ilwad, and we've heard obviously also from the Secretary General of the UN, and we'll be talking about the call for a global ceasefire in a moment. We've heard Anne Linda stressing the importance of cooperations and the risks and the opportunities which she sees. So what do you think are the implications for cooperation now in the context, I mean, the broader European context in which you're working, including but not only in conflict-affected areas? How do you see the relationship between these pandemic and peace and security issues?
Well, thanks, Dan. It is a great pleasure to join my fellow panelists today in this important discussion, and so thank you very much for having me here. Now, let me start with multilateralism. And here, frankly, I don't see a need for a revolution in the multilateral system to prevent, to manage crises like the one we are currently going through. We already have effective multilateral mechanisms for crisis management, and not only for health crises. Of course, yes, there is room for improvement. Multilateral institutions can and should modernize, they should adapt, they should become more effective, more flexible, so they can react faster and respond even better. But what we can and must do is to make better use of existing tools for international cooperation. And clearly, for that to happen, we need more political leaders who understand and who support the value of multilateralism. In the current crisis, unfortunately, what we have seen, at least until very recently, is a patchwork of national strategies to contain the virus, with many countries closing borders and turning inward. Unilateral and isolationist strategies may indeed seem pragmatic in the first instance, but what we really need to counter the virus is cooperation. We need cooperative approaches to address global challenges. So in short, I believe we need more multilateralism and we need better multilateralism, but we don't need a new paradigm. Now, when it comes to what multilateral institutions can do to support national governments, let me focus on the OSCE, which works on security-related issues. And I think this angle is indeed very relevant, because the pandemic is not only a global health crisis, it's clearly a geopolitical event of historical proportions with immediate implications for peace and security. And there are already clear indications that the pandemic may accelerate existing trends, including growing distrust and polarization between and within states. And this clearly has far-reaching consequences that threaten international peace and security, which is of great concern to our organization. The OSCE leadership supported SG Guterres' call for a universal ceasefire. Unfortunately, I fear this plea has not been heard, at least not in our part of the world, and it is losing momentum. The window of opportunity for peace that it opened is, I'm afraid, closing. In key areas of OSCE engagement, the situation on the ground has even worsened. In eastern Ukraine, for instance, where we continue to witness ceasefire violations, OSCE monitors are facing greater difficulties than before the pandemic. Indeed, the pandemic seems to offer kind of an excuse for restricting their freedom of movement in some non-government controlled areas, which directly affects our ability to carry out the work on the ground, which is not only monitoring, but also facilitating local ceasefires. Clearly, enhancing peace and security also requires respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. This means that COVID-19 emergency measures should be proportionate, and Minister Linde has referred to that. They should be temporary, and clearly they should be in compliance with the rule of law and international commitments. Unfortunately, this has not been the case in some countries, including in the OSCE area. Government responses also need to take into account the pandemic's distinct implications for women and men, the gender lens. Again, Minister Linde has alluded to. While indeed the virus itself seems to affect men more severely than women, some of the pandemic's implication put women at much greater risk. And of special concern here is the increased risk of domestic and sexual violence during lockdowns and quarantines. We have addressed this issue in the OSCE over recent weeks quite extensively. And finally, we must also pay attention to the pandemic's devastating effects on the most vulnerable among us. And this is, in our part of the world, victims of human trafficking, it's migrants, it's refugees, it's IDPs. They all face increased risks in the current crisis. So clearly, special efforts are needed to protect these and other vulnerable populations. I will leave it there for now, but I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So, Thomas, thank you very much for that. I want to pick one point straight out of there and pass it straight on to Rosemarie DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political Affairs and Peacebuilding in the United Nations. And Thomas said, with regret, that the call for the ceasefire, this plea had not been heard, as he said, at least in our region. Can you give us some kind of overview of how you see the response to the UN Secretary General's ceasefire call and how that can be, how the UN is taking this forward?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for the invitation. Let me just say that even before the pandemic, the environment for conflict prevention and conflict resolution was challenging, and now we have the added complexity of COVID-19. When the Secretary General launched his appeal for a ceasefire, he did so to facilitate humanitarian assistance and to create space for diplomatic engagement. He kept stressing that there was a need to fight the common enemy, COVID-19, and not each other. Now, his appeal has received tremendous support around the world. 110 member states of the UN have endorsed his appeal. Regional partners have, including OSCE, civil society leaders, religious leaders, and even 24 armed groups. But support for the appeal hasn't always resulted in tangible improvements on the ground. In the Sahel, situation's deteriorating. In Libya, where the parties have called for humanitarian truces at various times in the past, the conflict is escalating. Violence continues in Afghanistan. And despite the unilateral announcement by Saudi Arabia, fighting is ongoing in Yemen. Now, we never thought this would be easy. We knew it was going to demand a lot of work on our part. Our envoys, our special representatives, my colleagues, my UN colleagues, our mediators are working very hard engaging conflict parties, in some cases remotely because of restrictions on movements. And of course, the Secretary General has been actively engaged. Obviously, it depends on the warring parties themselves, the political will, but we all have a role to play. There is no doubt. There is a need for a collective response to help silence the guns. And we need the weight of the international community behind us. We need those countries that have influence on conflict parties to use it now. And we need also those countries that have influence on the parties who are supplying the weapons and other material to use it now. We have a lot of work to do to translate this ceasefire call into real gains. I just want to raise a couple of other issues that I think are important to think about during this time, and that is the risks on stability, on peace and security going forward. And we see a number of them, and we have to be vigilant about this. Erosion of trust in public institutions due to perceptions that the conflict was not, the pandemic was not well handled, as Thomas has mentioned. The destabilizing effects of the economic situation leading to civil unrest. The potential for real political tensions and unrest because of postponement of elections, or elections that were carried out, for example, in substandard conditions, questioning the credibility of these elections. Obviously, we see it already. We see conflict parties taking advantage of the situation, of the uncertainty caused by the pandemic, to advance their gains, creating increased violence and making it all the harder for a peaceful resolution of a conflict. Increased terrorism, and of course, the possible triggering of more human rights violations around the world. Now, all of this happening at a time when it's all the harder to reach people, where movements are restricted, making conflict resolution, conflict prevention much more difficult. It doesn't mean that we should not try. We must continue to try. We absolutely need to translate early warning to early action if we expect to build better after this is over.
So I think thanks very much, Rosemary. And I think that one of the things that comes out of both of those sets of comments there, is that it is very easy to think that in the time of the pandemic, everything will change. And indeed, it's very important to think about how many things will change in politics, in our lives, in international institutions, in our street at home, and so on. But many things don't. And one of the things is that there are many groups that carry on doing politics. And one of the things that you do when you do politics is you take advantage of opportunities. So if there is weakness on the other side, that could be a chance for you to push forward. So I think that the call for the ceasefire is a very realistic call, because it is made in the belief that the problem will not just go away of its own accord. So there is really hard political work that's required to do. Is there anything you can say, Rosemary, about how actually that is done when you have to do it through virtual contact rather than through being able to fly in and sit down and find people and talk with them?
Of course, look, it's always, I think, more effective if you can be in a room with a person, or if you can lock a couple of conflict parties together in a room. But we have seen, for example, in Yemen, our envoy is on the phone, on various Zoom meetings daily with parties in Yemen, with those who support the parties. He has been working, and I think producing some excellent results moving forward, hoping to actually finally broker a ceasefire and the launch of a true political process. Not easy, tremendous amount of effort that goes into it, but a receptivity that's important on the part of certain parties in this case. That's
interesting and encouraging. Thomas, do you have some of this same kind of practical experience in the OSCE that you could pass on?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a very concrete example are negotiations to implement the Minsk agreements on the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And here we have the trilateral contact group that has been meeting in Minsk. And now, obviously, since the outset of the COVID crisis, has not been able to do so. But there have been virtual meetings, so far 3 meetings. And so technically speaking, that has worked very well. So purely from a formal point of view, no issue. technology helps us. But clearly, what is missing is the informal spaces, to kind of test ideas informally, to see if you can strike a deal on this and that. That is clearly missing. And so far, I think we haven't invented informal spaces online. This, I think, still is a challenge. Of course, this is not enough to substitute for lack of political will, which is, at the end of the day, clearly the decisive factor. And Rosemary has alluded to that. But I think, perhaps we need also to be more creative in trying to create informal spaces online that are necessary if you want to advance in peace negotiations.
The big question of how you do a virtual walk in the woods. The contact, the back-channel contact between negotiators and so on. Jean-Marie, let me turn to you, former Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Affairs and now on the governing board of CIPRI. And one of the tasks which I have to carry out each year for CIPRI as part of my job there is I write the introduction to the yearbook. And for some reason, unknown to anybody, including me, I took upon myself the responsibility at the beginning of each of the introductions in passing years to say how I think the world is going. And it hasn't been really very optimistic reading, very cheerful reading when I go back over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that in 2019, we saw another downward turn of the screw with some really quite big crises in the Gulf and between India and Pakistan. So as well as, of course, the bigger geopolitical issues between the USA and China and so on. So stepping out and looking at things in that bigger context, how do you think the geopolitics and the pandemic are affecting each other, and what are the impacts for this on the way that we think about security and stability and the opportunities or risks we see?
Well, what we have seen is that at the central level of the global powers, there is more division than unity. Rosemary DiCarlo, Thomas noted that the call of the Secretary General had generated real momentum on the ground. So on the ground in regional organization. What has been dramatically missing, as the Foreign Minister was also saying, is in the Security Council any measure of agreement. The pandemic has further divided the Security Council instead of uniting it. What we have seen is that a resolution that should have passed quickly 6 weeks later is still, has very little hope of going through, because there is no agreement on the language to be used on how to support health organization, which was a compromise, not to mention the WHO, which has become a dirty word for the President of the United States. That's absurd and shocking. The division between China and the United States is something that is really hampering the global efforts. It's hampering the global efforts on the pandemic, on the fight against the pandemic, because obviously the WHO is the institution that has to be used, and the WHO is doing a lot of good work today. And the WHO is particularly important in countries that have weak health system, and that it can help with its expertise. So the WHO doesn't get the support it needs. And on the conflict front, the kind of engagement that is necessary is not happening. And I think that is particularly damaging, because many of the conflicts that we see today are conflicts where the local, the regional, and the global are intertwined. So when the local is willing to come to some kind of agreement, and the regional sometimes is also willing to push in the right direction, if at the global level there is no such interest, the whole effort falls apart. And that's what we are seeing at the moment. In the call of the Secretary General, there were 4 countries that were mentioned especially. There was Yemen, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. We heard from Rosemary DiCarlo that there is still some hope maybe for Yemen. It's very sad to see what the situation is in Syria. It's very sad to see the horrors happening in Afghanistan. And in Libya, we are stuck. And we are stuck because there are external actors who see the COVID-19 as an opportunity to push their advantage, instead of seeing that everybody will be a loser in that crisis. So the geopolitics today, they are the geopolitics of the politics of fear and nationalism. And nationalism is war. Nationalism is a poison that destroyed Europe in the 20th century, and that has a potential to destroy the world in the 21st century.
So, I mean, in some ways, to turn from that bleakness then to the results of the online poll is quite interesting, because I think that people are reacting to these same realities that you're talking about and to these risks, and also understanding how issues are intertwined with each other. Therefore, actions must be mutually supportive, and therefore the different groups and communities have got to work together. Strikingly, both for the pandemic, so that we come back well from it, and for building peace, though there are constituencies, of course, supporting this and that actor, most people are saying, get it together, all of them. We need the governments, we need the intergovernmental organizations, we need the private sector, we need the community organizations and the civil society organizations to get together and sort this out. Ilwad, thank you so much for your talk just now. I'm not quite sure at the moment whether we've got you on a complete AV link or whether we're going to it's a kind of hybrid arrangement with a telephone. But I think that we...
Well, I see you and I hear you.
Okay, well, I see you and hear you. So however it's happening, that's great. And there is a particular question has come to you, I guess, you know, a response to the talk that you just gave, from one of the people, Ambassador Mula, who is an eminent person in the Peace-Building Architecture Review, and asks you, first of all, offers you congratulations for a great talk, so let's all share in that, but then asks you, what good practices, what lessons can we draw from the Somali women in preventing conflict and in sustaining peace? So what do you think you have to offer to this online community in terms of practice and experience? We've heard it in terms of ideas and vision, but now you're being challenged to bring it forward in practice and experience.
Well, thank you very much. I think that that's an excellent question. We always talk about the need for further inclusion. We always talk about women's participation being integral to successful and sustainable peace solutions. And very rarely do we look at countries that are still in conflict as actually being able to offer solutions and lessons that the rest of the world can learn from. Somalia arguably has a long way to go to be considered a peaceful society, but the role that women have taken is much more than just victims. They are much more than just spoils of war. And when we've seen, when there are opportunities for inclusion, women rise to the occasion. Their unique influence within the community has a transformational potential beyond just top-down hard military approaches alone. We've seen women organize in ways that are exemplary to government structures, where they are not partisan, where they are not poisoned and motivated by tribalistic lines. We've seen women coming together for a collective greater goal. And that kind of inclusiveness is something that I think could be emulated. We've seen women fighting across all different levels for peace and security in Somalia, serving on the front lines. We have a government that surprisingly has been incredibly supportive of gender inclusion from the military perspective. My young sister has worked serving as a member of the Somali National Armed Forces, and we have a government in place right now that's empowering young women particularly to lead this charge. We have women serving within national human rights organizations, not only holding the government to account, but providing solutions, often in the face of a lot of threats, a lot of harassments, but refusing to be silenced. So we have a long way to go, and there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from women in Somalia, but globally. We see these examples throughout Africa, we see them throughout the global south and in the developed world as well too, but what we is still the strong commitment from the global community. We're coming to 20 years of celebrating the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And I would like to see this year us celebrating the number of women that have actually been empowered and put into positions as a result of the resolution, as opposed to be just celebrating the fact that we have the resolution. Yeah. Young women in peace and security fall within a unique gap, and I face this in my life in Somalia all the time, where there is some exclusion in the women peace agenda, and the youth peace agenda often looks at young men, but the role of young women in this space specifically falls within the cracks. And that is why it's so necessary for leaders to review the Missing Peace Report, which highlights the unique and specific role of young women in peace and security.
So thank you so much. If I were going to challenge you a little bit, to push you a little bit further, I would say that this makes an awful lot of sense when we think about normal times. And we're now, because of the pandemic, in abnormal times.
Yeah.
Are there ways in which, nonetheless, these kind of connections, threads of connection between women are able to survive in that kind of pandemic context?
I mean, this pandemic context has been a learning curve, I think, for everyone. It's further exacerbated in countries that are still in conflict. We are seeing the majority of those that are in the internally displaced people camps, in refugee camps, are women with small children in tow. Their vulnerability has been mentioned in my remarks, in the SG's remarks, and echoed throughout this conversation, but we haven't really yet fully delved into their potential. We've been working with young women and women in the IDP camps to share information, to ensure that the public content and awareness raising that's happening extensively online also trickles down to the offline spaces. And women have been the key messenger for this. They still have been the influencers in the field to be able to create that change that we actually need. So the agility, flexibility of women in even the most rural and hardest to reach communities is an untapped potential. And what I've learned through these very uncertain and unpredictable times is that we've had to completely do business differently. My work with the Elman Peace Center provides essential services, rehabilitation and reintegration of young men and women defecting from armed groups. We have rape crisis centers for survivors of sexual gender-based violence, mobile health clinics. All of these things are very traffic and people heavy. We don't have the luxury of shutting down, but through capacity building of women within the community, we've been able to transition into more of a socially distanced hybrid way of doing our work. And we've seen the biggest entry point for community has been women for us. So there's a lot of lessons that we're learning, that we know that the whole world is learning, and the strength of a forum like this is not just focusing on what doesn't work, but pulling our resources and our knowledge together and ensuring that we share these lessons. And that's my intent and commitment moving forward from this, to share live and direct with solutions and tangible ways that we can come together in this pandemic and share what we've learned from the field.
And find the way forward, learn from each other and learn about what works. Jean-Marie, I wanted to turn to you to ask a question about the UN General Assembly. But was there a point you wanted to make as you listened to Ilwad?
Yes, as I was listening to Ilwad, I was thinking that one of the few benefits of this horrible crisis is that we learn the power of the virtual world. Old friends we did not connect with, we now connect with them. And so I do believe that this sense of community, of virtual community, that of the Stockholm Forum today is an example of that. That's something that can be leveraged much more than it has been until now. I remember an example in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there were it's been a tragedy for women in Congo, as we all know, and how a network of women, but at the time it was not a virtual network, empowered them, that they didn't feel isolated in their little village, in their community. I think now what we need is that virtual community of concerned people to be strengthened through the virtual means that we're experimenting today with the Stockholm Forum and in other occasions. I mean, that's the point I was reacting to.
Sure. I mean, certainly with the forum now, the forum today, we are reaching a larger and more diverse audience than we have done before. On day one, we not only had the participants who are registered through the platform that we're using for the interaction, there were 3,000 people watching on YouTube as well. Right? And this is much bigger numbers than we normally have. Now, okay, this is nothing compared to the YouTuber influencers and their followings are in the millions. But for us to be able to get together for this quality of exchange of ideas and practice, and also for encouraging each other, I mean, there is an upside as well as a downside to this. What I was going to ask you, Jean-Marie, if I may, and then if she needs to, Rosemary DiCarlo has got to be able to come right back onto this. I wanted to go to what you were saying about the UN Security Council. Right? It's kind of shocking. That's what you were saying. Now, is there then, and this is a question which has come through from the online audience, does this mean that one should be exploring reform possibilities in the UN? Is this one of the things which is raised? For example, about the veto, or about the power of a small number of states? Or indeed, is this saying something about needing to boost the power or the influence, the role of the UN General Assembly as compared to the Security Council? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, Thomas might also want to comment on this, because if taken far enough, this could be the revolution in international instruments that he thinks is not necessary.
Well, I don't want to pour cold water on that issue. Indeed, the Security Council today is not what it should be. That is obvious to anybody. Now, a reform of the UN, technically today, where we see the United States on one side, China on the other, is totally impossible to effect. It will not happen. It requires a different mindset in those two countries and others, to be honest, but especially China and the United States. Without an agreement between China and the United States, there will not be a reform of the United Nations Charter. So that's the starting point. Does that mean that the UN cannot improve in its work? I think actually the Secretariat is showing every day that even when there is a paralyzed Security Council, there is leeway, as there is leeway in the UN agencies, which are doing a lot of good work. If I take the example of the WHO, I think the issue for which the Western countries, to be honest, have some responsibility is that it has become much too dependent on voluntary contributions instead of assessed contribution, obligatory contributions. And it's a strong UN agency is an agency which does not need to just cater to the pet programs. I mean, they can be very good programs, no question, but doesn't cater just to the programs pushed by this or that member state. I think that is dangerous for the spirit of independence and the capacity of initiative of UN agencies. So I think there are ways, short of an institutional reform, that I don't think is practical at this, considering international affairs as they are today. I think short of that reform, there is much space for making things work better. You know, the selection of officials, that's an area in which the Secretary General has some discretion. Ever since Kofi Annan, there has been a significant improvement in that selection, so that there are panels, there is competition in choosing people. I think that needs to be strengthened, so that the UN is, the Charter starts with "we the people," but it's an organization of states, and it has always struggled between being an organization of states and being "we the people." If it wants to be more of a "we the people" organization, it needs to assert its independence in a variety of ways that will not require a reform of the Charter, but that can make it stronger.
So, Rosemary, I'd like to invite you to comment upon that then.
Well, I always defer to Jean-Marie on many issues. I just want to add one thing about reform or the workings in particular of the Security Council. Now, I think the major problem we're dealing with today is that we have a number of countries who have very different interpretations of the basic principles on which the Charter is based. And I think that there's going to be a need for them to come to terms with that and come together. To agree on certain common interpretations of some of the values and the principles that we have long said were the basis of our international system. And without that, I don't think there's going to be a smooth way forward. I don't think it's just about reform and changing certain rules or regulations on how a body works. It's going to be more about really finding a common ground that seems to be lost right now and that we need desperately to move forward.
So, Thomas, if I can turn to you then, I want to, I hope this doesn't put you on the spot, but I want to ask you a question that again has come through from the online audience. I'll read it word for word and then we'll sort of see how best to interpret it. What can be done in cases where governments are using the pandemic to reduce political space for civil society activists and using security as a justification? It seems to me that in some ways this question picks up on exactly the kinds of concerns that Rosemary was just voicing about lack of a shared view about some of the principles of how the world community should operate. And it seems to me that, again, if we go to that online poll, which is saying, well, everybody has to cooperate, the result doesn't really give a special privileged role to governments in that. Now, of course, we know governments have power, they have resources, they're there to use that power and influence and resources for good ends, but the energies must all be coming together. And here we have, and I think it's been expressed by many people, the concern that the pandemic is in some ways being used as an excuse to close down on that space and therefore to narrow the possibilities for a good cooperation and an effective outcome. So all of that said, the question was what can be done about that? There's some thoughts you can give us along those lines?
Sure. Well, the good news is that we managed to maintain our core mandate, and that is serving as a platform for inclusive dialogue. And this, of course, allows to hold states accountable to the principles and commitments they have subscribed to in the framework of our organization. To be a bit more specific, we have managed to relaunch the meetings of the OEC Permanent Council, which is the weekly gathering of all 57 ambassadors of our participating states. We have now relaunched our committee meetings, our informal working groups, so everything online. Something that nobody, would have thought possible 7-8 weeks ago. It's possible now, so these platforms exist, and this also offers this possibility to hold states accountable. Now, unfortunately, and that's the bad news, the mood has not really changed among participating states. The spirit is still extremely confrontational. Nobody seems to be seriously, trying to use this opportunity, that together, jointly fighting this pandemic would offer in terms of identifying specific areas, where we could cooperate, where we could rebuild trust and confidence. Now again, perhaps on a more positive note, our executive structures, our field operations have very quickly responded to the situation, and not only in terms of protecting their staff with precautionary and preventive measures, but also by interacting very closely with local authorities and trying to figure out how can we support local authorities in all kinds of ways in dealing with the pandemic. Our institutions, ODIHR, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the High Commission on National Minorities, the representative on the freedom of media, all have immediately, started looking, monitoring, mapping at what is happening in terms of limiting the freedom of the media, for instance, or infringing on the rights of national minorities, or in limiting, weakening democratic institutions, the rule of law, human rights. So this monitoring, mapping function, and also to an extent watchdog function that is, signaling to participating states that indeed measures in the framework of COVID crisis management should be proportionate, should be time-bound, etc. So I think this, from a institutional side, this has been working quite well. A different story is what participating states do with these kinds of reports, maps, monitoring results.
Thank you, Thomas. I want to come to Ilwad with essentially the same question from a different perspective, not the international organization. The question is, what can be done in cases where governments are using the pandemic in this way, narrowing the space and using security as a justification? What would be your answer to that question? What would you advise, I suppose, NGO members or activists to be doing?
My advice would be for them to do what they have already been doing, not only in the face of this pandemic, but continuing to be vocal about this. I mean, it's not a shortage of what should NGOs and civil society organizations and youth activists do in the face of an ever-shrinking space for civil society during this pandemic. That's what we are already seeing. Before coronavirus, there's been a dangerously shrinking space for civil society across the board. And what I've seen across the world is, an enforced intent of civil society to create partnerships and layers of solidarity. The things that might be difficult for me, for example, to say in Somalia, an organization that I have partnerships with in the US or in Sweden isn't a freer place or position to echo my message. Civil society has always been a step ahead when it comes to organizing across borders and ensuring that there is allyship and support in places that it might be more conducive for protesting what we see as a crackdown of security forces on activists. And it's not only during this pandemic. And as I alluded to a bit during my keynote, is that we need to be able to hold governments to account. We need to have protection for civil society organizations for reprisals. When we see it, we have to be heard. And I think what we clearly see now is one of the innovations of this past decade is that even when people are silenced physically, the digital spaces and virtual connections and social media gives a voice to those that otherwise would not be heard. And I call on everyone on this panel, the people that are listening, to be cognizant of that. When there are small organizations, when there are individual human rights activists, young people that are talking about very difficult issues in very challenging environments, to echo that message and to be cognizant of your privilege of being in safety and help propel that. That's what civil society has been doing and will continue to do. Now it's just a matter of the global community helping those calls for human rights to hold the governments to account.
Right. I mean, in a way, you've got the two on each side. Thomas's perspective is of the international organizations, which can produce the reports, which can be monitors, which can be watchdogs, and so on. And there is a question of, well, okay, so what happens with that? Right? And then you have the civil society organizations as well, who can also be, and indeed must be, monitors and watchdogs, because they need the space in which to be organizing. So there is an alliance to be formed there between the civil society organizations and the international institutions, because actually on this, their interests are absolutely aligned. They both want and need to be holding individual governments to account. And the method, the instrument for doing that is transparency, however that's achieved, whether that's with the digital age or in old-fashioned ways. Now look, I want to, prompted by a question that's come in from Nigeria, from the online audience, I want to look at a different level perhaps than the one we've been mainly focused on. We've been talking about building peace in time of COVID-19, and I think that we've been talking and thinking, and quite rightly, about armed conflict and security between states and security of states. But there's also the security of people. And one of the issues that has been raised is, for example, there is considerable evidence of an increase in domestic violence, gender-based violence in the home. And one can understand how, in some circumstances, the lockdown leads to a kind of pressure cooker and has removed all of the valves that could release that pressure. And so, really sadly, violence comes out in the home and then usually with women and children on the receiving end of that. There's also, although the evidence appears to be mixed from different countries, there's the question of crime as well. And there are some kinds of crime in some places where there appears to be an increase. I mean, that is what the question coming in from Nigeria is saying, for example. So how do we relate how do we understand this? The pressure on people and on communities and that kind of violence and insecurity at the personal level. I wanted to start with Jean-Marie, but you're either sitting very, very still or we've actually lost the...
No, I just had a problem with the wireless. So now
okay.
I just got on the phone with you, but I did not hear your question. Sorry.
Well, I tell you what, I'll let the others answer it and you see if you can work it out as we go along. It's about the human security dimensions and the crime and gender-based violence in the home. Rosemary, can I turn to you with that question?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, we have seen, I think I'm echoing.
No, I think it's coming through fine. From our end, I think it's okay.
Okay, fine. I will continue, but it's echoing on my end. But we have seen, obviously, an increase in domestic violence. We've also seen where in some countries where we have UN agencies on the ground, where shelters have been created that also will allow them to live in isolation during this period. Extremely difficult issue to deal with, and the increasing, it's not, the question came from Nigeria, but we've seen this throughout the world. It is something that we will have to be very, cautious about, and deal with it very carefully, because I think the real concern we have is not only is it now, but it will continue. It'll be exacerbated even when the pandemic and when the lockdown is over. That we're seeing patterns that could continue and be really detrimental to many women and children as well. In terms of crime, we see the economic impact. There is no question. We see looting going on in certain places. We've seen looting of UN facilities, for example, because people are desperate. That's something that, on the one hand, is very worrisome, but we understand the impetus. But we also see the criminals who are taking now advantage of the situation to be able to gain more access to things that they wanted anyway, or the trafficking that takes place. It's something we've got to be vigilant about. We do have international agencies that deal in particular with cross-border crime at this time, and crime with serious crime within countries. But again, another very difficult situation, which, if not addressed, could create even greater instability than we see in some fragile states.
Jean-Marie, can I come back to you now?
I'm trying to connect. If you can ask another speaker first, I'll be fine.
Okay, we'll keep on working around it. Thomas. And then I'll come to Ilwad, and then we'll see if Jean-Marie will be able to hook up.
Yes, I mean, I can more or less echo what Rosemary has said. Clearly, what we have seen now in recent week is a clear increase of domestic violence. On the one hand, due to the self-isolation measures, but then also due to the lack of accessible support services, be it in the health field or be it police. We did try to address these issues over the last few weeks by launching an awareness campaign targeting decision makers, but also law enforcement agencies. And also a more general audience. Now, crime, what we normally subsume under the heading of combating transnational threats. Yes, of course, we see criminals starting to exploit the COVID crisis by in terms of cybercrime, fraud, counterfeit, substandard goods. These are new issues that our law enforcement agencies have to cope with. We see there is clearly perhaps now more in the medium term, a high risk of organized crime groups and corrupt officials exploiting the emergency for profit and in the recovery phase for skimming public funds intended to bolster the economy. And we see in the area of border security and management that border services are totally overstretched or working close to capacity, and at the same time face a surge in cross-border criminal activities. And this is not limited to illegal border crossings. It is also very much human trafficking and smuggling of illicit goods. So here, there is a huge challenge to border security agencies, to border management in general.
Ilwad.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I'll just add to that is we do see the stark increase of gender-based violence and sexual violence that's happening as a result of the lockdowns and that pressure cooker, as you had alluded to. But a lot of women and girls and children as well too, that are trapped indoors with their abusers. So it echoes also the need for very gendered specific solutions to crises like coronavirus. And I was very interested and excited to hear about the proposed or the resolution that's in process right now that the Minister of Foreign Affairs had discussed, of looking at how to best protect and include women in responses to COVID. Without echoing what's already been said, this is a reality. We see it in Somalia, women that are facing much more consistent forms of physical abuse, unable to escape. We see it across the continent, around the world. And even when we look at the issue of crime, we see that it's a lot more nuanced than what we may just see from the surface. We've seen destroying of public property, looting, and riots across the continent where people don't have the luxury to also stay home, and they can't stockpile food and toilet paper, and they also are taking to the streets sometimes to demand what they need to survive during a crisis like this. I think that looking at all of these issues from a nuanced perspective and understanding that we have to find solutions that look at people's real situations, not just applying what works in the West in more privileged communities to the developing world as well too. We saw the impacts of that the social services, the institutional strengths do not exist, and does result also in more crime from those that are less advantaged.
I mean, there's a lot of abstraction in some of the proposals which are made that seem to treat poor countries and conflict-affected countries and countries with very weak infrastructure as if they were a kind of European country having a bad time for a bit. And actually, they're in a very, very different circumstance with very different history. And this was being stressed in yesterday's panel, is people who want to help need to know what the situation is in which they want to help.
Yes.
And I think for that, we very much rely, to come back, we rely on civil society activists to provide that information through. Jean-Marie, I think you're back with us. Comment on this.
Well, I think COVID-19 is really an example where civic engagement is essential. We see it in rich countries. In New York, I see if people don't take responsibility for themselves, they become a danger for others. And so I think this is very true in all countries, with the big difference that that when you live in a slum, how do you self-isolate? Obviously, the problems are of a different order of magnitude in countries which are stricken with poverty. But I do think that this COVID-19 crisis emphasizes personal responsibility and community work. Because if you cannot, with weak states, you need to organize yourself at a very basic level to fight the disease, to distribute scarce resources. So I think this horrible thing, in some ways, can also be a great incentive for communities to come together at the grassroots level. We are told every day in the rich country where I live by the governor of the state of New York how important it is to take responsibility. I think it's important in Somalia. I think it's important in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Yemen, everywhere. And so for me, this pandemic should be an opportunity to mobilize at the grassroots level, because at the end of the day, our future is what we will make of it.
So moving on again, thank you so much for that comment, but moving on to the next question, it's a very specific one. Rosemary, it's about the Peacebuilding Commission. And perhaps one could also think about the Peacebuilding Fund in this respect, and the peacebuilding architecture is under review this year, under discussion. What do you see as being the possibilities to bring together the peace agenda, the health side of the human security agenda, the climate change side of the human security agenda in the work of bodies like the Peacebuilding Commission or instruments like the Peacebuilding Fund?
Thank you. And first of all, let me say thank you to Ilwad for plugging the Peacebuilding Fund earlier. It does need support to keep going. I think there are tremendous possibilities. As of now, Peacebuilding Fund, Peacebuilding Commission, actively involved in local initiatives, local peace initiatives, intercommunal dialogues, ways of dealing with conflicts, tensions among communities, for example, because of climate change, farmers and herders, etc. Youth, bringing youth together, particularly from differing backgrounds, differing ethnic groups, religious groups in certain parts of the world. We have tremendous, I think, potential to use this mechanism, first the fund and the various projects that are designed along with governments and civil society in various parts of the world. But also, I think, with the Peacebuilding Commission that has broadened its mandate. In the past, the Peacebuilding Commission had several countries on its agenda and only focused on those countries. Now they're looking at a whole range of countries and bringing issues to the forefront. In some cases, briefing the Security Council on some of their findings. So I think there's a lot of potential in the future now and as we go forward to use this mechanism and certainly to use the fund in order to support viable initiatives. Thank you.
And Jean-Marie, the question as it came in online was also addressed to you. Do you have a comment on that, the possibilities for the PBF and PBC in this kind of context?
Well, we see in all the conflict-affected countries how important is to have projects that shore up whatever can be done at the political level. And so the Peacebuilding Fund was really a great creation to strengthen the action of the Security Council. I would go one step further. I think one has to connect better also the Bretton Woods institution with the United Nations. It's a different order of magnitude, but I think in this present crisis, we are going to see in the coming years how all countries are going to be inward looking. So there's a risk of that. And there will be a much need for credit extended to the poorest countries and also middle income countries. And that has to come from the IMF through new drawing rights, special drawing rights, and through the World Bank through targeted programs. And I think the UN is going to have to work very closely. It already does it. But we should reach a different level in the cooperation between the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations. So I see the Peace Building Fund as a critical instrument, very targeted for a specific peace building situation in a number of cases. And I see the Bretton Woods institutions as providing a more structural, broader support so that there is solidarity in the international community.
Well, Rosemary said earlier that she deferred to you in many things, and I think that she likes the tune that you're singing at the moment. And I must say, having myself been on the Peace Building Fund Advisory Group for 4 years, that I also see the fund as being really a potentially extremely important, useful, adaptable instrument, one that can be used very often at speed. At a surprising degree of speed when you look at the record of big institutions. I have a specific question for Thomas and then a specific question for Ilwad, both coming in through the online audience. And then I have a closing question for each of you, the same question for each of you about a kind of a practical takeaway. But Thomas, the question which I wanted to ask you is, do you see from where you sit some kind of risk of, whether we call it donor fatigue, or just kind of fading away of interest in peace-building issues of the kind that we've been talking here because of the pressure of the pandemic and the demands which the pandemic and recovery from the pandemic is going to be placing on resources? So do you look ahead with a certain amount of concern at that trajectory? I suppose the alternative, rosier vision would be that that trajectory could provide an opportunity for linking the different issues together. But I don't know whether it's just donor fatigue or just fading interest at the international level, but what do you think? Is there a risk of that?
Well, I wouldn't call it donor fatigue. I would rather call it a risk of diverting resources to issues that are considered more urgent in combating the crisis and its immediate aftermath, and in particular, of course, social and economic challenges. I think there is a risk. For the time being, I don't see it yet, but again, it's probably too early. Clearly, in my programmatic departments that depend to quite an extent on extra budgetary funding, there is, of course, this concern that this would negatively influence their funding perspectives. But again, to conclude on a more positive note, I think we need, of course, to keep making our case. And again, for the time being, I haven't seen concrete indications of this happening.
And Ilwad, the specific question that came in for you was about women in peacemaking processes. How can we know that women who are being included in those processes are really there, or indeed are they really there to have influence in policy making? Or are there still examples, and maybe too many examples, as I think there were at one time, of it being a kind of a gestural politics to say, oh yes, and the women, without actually providing, without actually listening, and without actually providing real opportunity to influence the processes? What do you see on that? Is this real change happening, or still a little bit kind of cosmetic?
Well, I mean, tokenism is something that not only women face, but also youth as well too. You know, kind of just having the token woman or the token young person in a room as a seat warmer, if you will, if they're not meaningfully included. That is a reality that exists, but I think we've come so far, and there's such a big, strong global movement that there aren't that many examples of women who actually would allow themselves to be reduced that way, even when the agenda sometimes is devised that way. We have a lot of, great examples of women in very high senior positions, as our panel also demonstrates, that the ceiling is slowly starting to be chipped away at. But so there's been progress there, even when some certain agendas do give a space for a woman to make remarks just to tick that box. There's a growing understanding and movement that I'm quite proud of to be a part of and to have contributed to, and to see that that's not really being accepted anymore. And that's why right now, as we are coming to celebrating 20 years of the resolution, that women in peace and security are not necessarily celebrating the fact that we have this historic resolution. We are holding governments account to how many women actually have gone positions as a result of it. How many women have actually mediated or mitigated or been part and parcel of writing peace agreements. Those are the indicators that we're looking to track, not how many women were in the room. So it's a nuanced discussion as well too, because it kind of bleeds into the wider conversation on quotas, gender quotas. Are they good? Are they bad? But just an example from my country in Somalia, I was very much in favor of the quota of having 30% women involved with government at the onset, because 30 ensured that at least there's a pathway open. Without that quota, there was not an opportunity for entrance. Now that we've awakened this movement, there's a lot of women that are candidates for the elections that we have coming up. Doesn't mean you can cap us at 30%. We can reach 50 or 60 or 70 or 100%. So quotas are often an entry point, but they should not become the new ceiling as well too.
Right.
And
No, I think I see as well that same kind of progress being made. I mean, as far as I'm concerned now, if we're finding it difficult to invite women, for example, onto a panel to take part in the Stockholm Forum, if we're finding that hard, that's our fault, right? Because there are so many. It is different from 30 or 40 years ago. There are so many people now, women who are active, who are knowledgeable, who are taking the lead, alongside men, alongside older people, alongside younger people. I mean, it is moving forward and it is making progress. Here is my one question to each of you to finish with, and it's about 30 seconds that you have to answer it, so you cannot go into detail. It is the question of what one thing would you undertake to do or like to see done in this field that we're talking about, of the relationship between the pandemic and building peace. One concrete thing that our online audience can go away and say, okay, she thinks that's a good idea, I'm going to put some effort into that. But we'll begin with a he. We'll go along the panel in this order. Jean-Marie first.
Well, what I would do is create a virtual network of focused each time on a different country, maybe once a week or twice a month, where we would have the kind of format that we have here, with people from the country concerned and then people from elsewhere to build bridges. And it would have the benefit of creating greater awareness and also empowering the people who can feel isolated. I think we have to make much more of that virtual network that we're experiencing today. There are plenty of Zoom meetings today around the world. We need to create a sort of regular rendezvous where we peace build together.
Beautiful idea. Ilwad.
If there's one thing you take away from the messages I've shared today and have maybe appreciated the fact that we have such a varying level of geographic coverage, influence and positions that this panel has, I want you to know that I am not the exception of a young person working in the field and with one foot in the global policy space as well too. Rather, I am the norm. And one practical action you can take is read the Missing Peace Report, which is the progress study on the UN Secretary General's resolution 2250 on the positive role of young people in peace and security. If we're looking for solutions, if we're looking for people who can actually be activated during this crisis, you will find tangible examples with an empirical evidence base of who to call in every country on the world.
Brilliant, thank you. Rosemary.
I think that what we need to do is not only when we have our virtual gatherings or other gatherings, talk about the risks, the problems, but we've got to start telling the good news stories as well. We've got to put forth the examples of how people can work together, where they are working together, as a way of encouraging more people to do so.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. And Thomas.
I believe we should give it another serious try to implement SG Guterres' call for a universal ceasefire in our region, and in particular in eastern Ukraine. We have an immediate opportunity for doing so. The Trilateral Contact Group is taking place tomorrow and after tomorrow, and I'm confident that Special Representative Heidi Grau will try hard to facilitate the recommitment to the ceasefire, and I would very much encourage the sides to come along.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Virtual network, read the missing peace report, tell the good news, and put our efforts into getting a ceasefire in the OSCE region, especially in eastern Ukraine. Thomas Greminger from OSCE, Rosemary DiCarlo from the UN, Ilwad Elman from Somalia and the Elman Center, and Jean-Marie Guénaud from New York and CIPRI and everywhere. Thank you all. This has been a superb discussion. I think there are so many takeaways. I'm going to just finalize on one thing, and I'm sorry if I'm boring for saying this, but it seems to me that once again, one of the things or two of the things that we have learned from this conversation are knowledge is important. We need to know our stuff. We need to know what is happening on the ground, and we need to know what is happening in international institutions. And secondly, cooperation is the new realism. If you think you can get it done by yourself, you're much mistaken. In a little bit less than 15 minutes now, at 16:30 CET, the next session is Strategic Dialogue on Africa First, Igniting a Growth Resolution. And please rejoin us tomorrow for the panel on UN peace operations and COVID-19, which is at 3 p.m. CET time. For now, thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you for taking part.